Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Times Literature Festival 2021. I'm Vinay Sitapati. I'm an associate professor of political science at Ashoka University. And with us today is none other than Amish. Amish is a best-selling author, 5 million and more copies he's sold. So he needs no introduction. And for the next 45 minutes, we're going to talk about his latest book, Suhail Dev. And I just want to kickstart with a simple question, which is that the 5 million readers of yours love your your style, your touch. I found it a page turner. That I finished a paragraph and the end of the paragraph was kicking me into moving to the new paragraph. So that's the most important test of a book. That do you want to finish it? And I was wondering, I suspect this is the first time, like James Patterson, that you employed a team, right? You come up with the idea, and then you tell the idea to the writing team, you show them the research, and then they produce a first draft, and then you work on that draft and you have subsequent drafts, right? So to readers of Amish, right, how are you able to reassure them, or how were you able to reassure them that this book had Amish 100%?
Look, I mean, the first thing I have to be honest that it's not Amish 100%. So, which is why I make it very clear that this is a writer's center book. One shouldn't mislead. But I should add one more step in the steps that you laid out, that even the story summary, the story synopsis, which would be 5,000 words or 10,000 words, is mine. So I am a bit of a control freak. So the full story is mine, and then the first draft is written by the team. What it does essentially is it increases my capacity. I have too many story ideas for one lifetime, and ideally I'd like to finish as many of them as I can before I die. Don't want to carry them to my cremation fire. So hence this idea of working with a writer's center. The book has done as well as my other books. It's sold not a few million copies, but it sold a few lakh copies, 3-4 lakh, which is actually quite decent from numbers. So it has been received well by readers, and it carries all the elements that are a part of my standard fiction books. That ideally it should be a page-turning story, which reader feedback tends to show that it is, and I'm glad you liked it as well. I respect your writing a lot. I respect your opinion, but for me, the stories are never an end in itself. For me, the story is just a means. It's a wrapper through which I would like to convey some philosophy, some thoughts that I have. So that is also there in this book. All my books have some core philosophies that I want to convey through the wrapper of a story. This one has that.
So Amish, I want to get immediately to that core philosophy. So of course, there's for the few readers who haven't read the book, there's a lot of masala. There's a love interest. There's a gay love story. There's a heterosexual love story. There's betrayal. There's everything you want. In a page turner. But you also have a philosophy, right? And in some ways, the philosophy are repeated references to redefining dharma, or sort of defining dharma the true way, right? And in some sense, that argument can actually be a little controversial, right? Because at least what I got from the book is, Suhail Dev repeatedly saying that a definition of dharma that privileges non-violence at every step is wrong, right? And a definition of dharma where you are following rules of engagement with an enemy that doesn't follow the same rules is actually weak and wrong, right? For example, if you say the dharmic tradition is that one must, not attack at night, right? Or one must, always treat your surrendered enemy with respect, right? Not kill. Suhail Dev doesn't do either of this, right? And sort of in some sense, the denouement of the book is, whether his enemy should be, his Turkic Muslim enemy should be burnt, right? And Suhail Dev's Indian Muslim colleague says, of course he should be burnt because he's not a true Muslim, because he massacres the innocent. And there's a back and forth, and finally Suhail Dev decides to burn him, even though a traditional view of dharma may say that you have to accord the enemy the respect of his or her religion, right? So can you tell us a little more about this core reinterpretation of dharma to make it more?
Vinay,
And critics could push you and say that you are saying dharma means ends justifies the means.
Vinay, the thing with dharma is it's a very complex concept. It's not a list of commandments. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. Dharma doesn't treat you like a child. It treats you like an adult. Right? And in terms of warfare as well, there are various archetypes, if you want to call it that. There is Lord Ram's approach to war, right? Which would always be straight no matter what. There's Lord Krishna's approach, where for the sake of the greater good, you do what you have to do. Right? And this is the debate, a part of this is the debate that happens at the end with the decision that King Suheldev makes. Because, and there is a philosophy, there is a Sanskrit line, it comes down from ancient times, Shate Shatyam Samacharit. Dusht ke saath dushtata hi karni chahiye. That you have to speak to an enemy in a language that that enemy understands. Now, the debate that happens, which you refer to, because and it's essentially a debate that happens between Indian Hindu and an Indian Muslim. The Indian Hindu is saying, no, that Turkic Muslim has to be given the respect, or his corpse has to be given the respect, or that his religion demands. And the Indian Muslim is saying, you are trying to say that he's one of us. We are telling you he's not one of us. Right? Many Indians don't know this. Most don't know where the 10 Pakistani terrorists who came to Mumbai in 2018, most don't know where they are buried. There's a reason for that. The Indian Muslim community refused to accept those bodies. They said, we will not accept them, they're not Muslims. It is an indictment of the kind of media that we have, that they haven't actually publicized this. Right? Most Indians actually don't know this. Right? So the argument that the Indian Muslim makes in King Suheldev is the argument that the Indian Muslims have made today on Pakistani terrorists. Sad that most Indians don't know this. King Suheldev has his approach. What he says is the following, that what is the duty, what is the dharma of a warrior? Right? And his Indian Hindu follower says the dharma of a warrior is to win, but win without breaking any rules of war. And King Suheldev says it would be perfect if life has given you that option. Right? What if life does not give you that choice? Because you don't make choices in a world the way it should be. You make choices in a world the way it is. And what if the choices that life has given to you is that you have only two options? One option, follow the rules of war and lose. The other option, break the rules of war and win. Now, if you lose, your innocent followers who are standing behind you, who are expecting you as a warrior to protect them, will suffer at the hands of that enemy. And we know what happened, what people like Mahmud Ghazni did. And he said, on the other hand, you can break the rules of war as a warrior and win and protect the innocents that are behind you, even though you know, according to the laws of dharma, because you have broken the rules of war, your soul will be punished in this life or the next. Essentially, what King Suheldev, the argument he makes is this, that a warrior, a true leader, is not just one who's willing to sacrifice his life for his people. He's one who's willing to sacrifice even his soul for his people. And to him, that is dharma. There are many warriors in the last 1,000 years who actually fought this. Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, Suheldev. And perhaps that's the reason we are the only pre-Bronze Age culture that is still alive. The invaders who came here, we see them as Muslim invaders. I make that argument. They're not Islamic. We don't call the British invasion the Christian invasion? Why do we call the Turkic colonial invasion the Muslim invasion? Indian Muslims weren't a part of it. The same invaders who came here went to various other parts of the world. They were the military superpowers of the world. How India is the only land that is ancient culture that is still alive. They are the only pre-Bronze Age culture that is still a living culture. I believe a part of it is perhaps that our warriors understood that they have to fight the way they have to fight to protect their innocence. And that's the argument essentially being made. Lord Krishna's path.
No, fair enough, Amish. But since I'm a political scientist, I must push you a little bit on the political questions. Now, I know that you're scrupulous in not having a political opinion publicly. You're very, very careful, right? But it's hard to read your book and not see that Narendra Modi has exactly the same view of history that you do, right? And this is not to tar you or to push you in that sense at all. To give you just one example, as you know, Suheldev now is highly politicized. You mentioned that in your introduction itself, and the reason is quite clear that Suheldev is seen as the Raja or the leader of the Rajbar community in UP, especially in East UP, and they are 15% of the population. And so this is another way in which the BJP reaches out to OBCs, especially MBCs, to get them in the Hindutva fold, right? Now, you are very careful in not assigning a caste to him. You say that. But you are clear that he's a subaltern caste, right? While the debate is he a Pasi, is he a Rajbar, is he a Rajput? The Rajput members are saying that, you're appropriating our icon. And I wanted to push you a little bit on that, which is that, in the absence of very strong historical evidence on Suheldev, is the version that you're seeing in complete alignment with the BJP? Not that you intended it, as a consequence.
Look, it's let me put it this way, and as you said rightly, I never comment on politics. I'm an Indian. I identify myself completely as an Indian. My books and the blurbs that you see on it, you'll find politicians, journalists, thinkers from both sides of both shades of opinion, both shades of the ideological divide, if you want to call it that, supporting my books. So I get along with anyone who is pro-India, right? In terms of which community he belonged to, what were the actual facts of history at that point of time? I think it's best if that research is done by scholars rather than me. I'm a storyteller. There's a difference between scholars and public intellectuals. Public intellectuals don't do primary data research by themselves. Their job is to read the works of scholars who do primary data research and then translate that into easily understandable stories or articles, right? That's our job. I wish scholars would study this. A thing that I would suggest to scholars is, we must expand our breadth of reading a lot more, not just go by texts created during British times. It is erroneous to say that Indians did not keep records or did not write. That is completely wrong, actually. There are 3 million Sanskrit manuscripts that survive till today, according to the national, and it has been tabulated by the National Mission of Manuscripts. That's more than the rest of the ancient world combined. And this is despite many manuscripts being burned to ashes in Nalanda, Takshashila, when they were all destroyed. Nalanda by Bhaktiar Khilji, Udayagiri, there are various universities that were destroyed. We lost a lot of manuscripts then, but even then there are 3 million that survive. So primary data is there. The second thing that I would suggest scholars should do is look at folk tales and folk traditions as well, as is happening in research on English history. I'm in London out here. the stories of the narrative of the formation of England as a country. And you're well read, I'm sure you're aware. It's about King Alfred the Great, and then his son and his grandsons, the Anglo-Saxons, who essentially formed the concept of England. Right? A lot of the stories of King Alfred the Great and his son and grandson, and his daughter, his son, daughter, and then grandson, who essentially formed England, a lot of it is actually on folk traditions, right? On folk tales, on other means of research, not just writing, and that too writing of the conquerors. Say you wrote the story of the Anglo-Saxons based only on Norman texts or the conquerors from French. That would obviously be bigoted and biased. Right? So this is a suggestion perhaps for scholars to take up. Lastly, I would like to point out that there is a version of history that is taught to us, which I think injects poison into today's body politic. And I'll repeat what I said earlier, that if we don't call the British colonial rule the Christian invasion, why the hell do we call the Turkic colonial rule the Islamic invasion? Bollywood has added to the confusion. When they show British rulers, they'll show a Gora white-skinned guy speaking English. When they show the Turkic colonial rulers, they will show someone like a Ranveer Singh or Prithviraj Kapoor or a Hrithik Roshan, very clearly Indian, speaking Urdu. First, the Turks did not look Indian. They were Central Asian, they were from the steppe lands. To us, they would have looked Chinese. Secondly, they didn't speak Urdu. Urdu is our language, boss. They spoke Turkic or Persian. We wouldn't have understood anything of what they were saying. They were foreigners. Right? And this, in my mind, injects poison into today's body politic. Should we actually have and I would think perhaps a narrative based on facts to show that actually they were foreigners? Of course, they were horrible people, but they were foreigners. They have nothing to do with Indians or Indian Muslims.
Amish, I want to take you back to the right in the beginning of the book, which is the sacking of Somnath by Muhammad of Ghazni. And you describe it in vivid and agonizing and brutal detail. Now, as you must definitely know, the Marxist historian Romila Thapar has written a book on Somnath, right? And to kind of summarize the argument, of course, it is a Marxist version. There's no running away from that. But her argument is that that she's not saying that the sacking of Somnath didn't happen, right? But she's saying that if you look at the historical sources, almost all the sources on the sacking of Somnath comes from the invaders, from the Turkic invaders, right? There's very little of it from Indian and Hindu sources, right? And she surmises from it that maybe the sacking of Somnath didn't have the same effect on the Hindu body politic that we imagine today, and that your book, begins with.
How many times was Somnath temple rebuilt? Would you know?
No.
Historically, rebuilt after destructions. 17 times. Okay? It wasn't the only one that was attacked. There's a book by Catherine Nixie, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World. And this was a tide of history. I'm not saying people today need to be blamed for it, but it didn't just happen in India. Monotheists faced across the world massacred all pagan cultures. That's how they all disappeared. Majority of the world in ancient time was pagan. Most of the ancient pagans, the Greco-Roman, Pharaonic Egypt, Central Americans, Mesopotamians, all of them actually, the Celtic, I'm living in the UK, surrendered and gave up. Right? I went to Parthenon Pantheon in Rome. It wasn't my religion. It was Greco-Roman religion. But even me, as an idol worshipper, I felt a sense of pain when I went there. It was sad what happened. I mean, You want to build a church, build it somewhere else. Why do you have to destroy what was a pagan temple? But the Italians whose legacy it is don't feel a sense of pain. They haven't rebuilt anything. That itself shows how important it was to Indians and to Hindus. And this is not the only temple. Repeatedly, Meenakshi was destroyed, was rebuilt. Meenakshi ji, repeatedly across the country, which is why we are the only pre-Bronze Age culture that is still around. If it was not important to us, like it is not important to the descendants of the Phoenicians or the in Libya or in the Middle East, or the descendants of the Greco-Romans, or the descendants of the Celts, it is not important to them. They've forgotten. Remember, a culture dies when its descendants forget. That's how culture dies. Most cultures across the world, the memories have been reset, right? So even in Europe, which sees itself as a descendant of Greco-Roman culture, it's very conveniently only the philosophies and the sciences. Everything else has been airbrushed out. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, they weren't Christians, right? And in the pagan way, I mean, for example, those who were goddess worshippers, it was a part of every part of their life. It wasn't just something where they went to a temple for, but all that has just been airbrushed out of their story. So it has been forgotten. This itself is proof of how important it is to the Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, Sikhs to survive. And I'll repeat once again, it has nothing to do with Indian Muslims or Indian Christians today. Just like it is grossly unfair for Israelis today to blame German Christians today for what the German Nazis did. That is wrong. Of course it's wrong. But you will still speak of it. But if the reaction is not, and if most of us, if the reaction, just because it is not immense rage today, doesn't mean that we don't feel the pain. Because we do, it is still alive.
So Amish, I want to take off on that because, at one level, the book is definitely a revisionist account from at least the way traditional history in India has been taught, as you said. But at another level, it contains a lot of contemporary, progressive, even woke mores, right? Norms. For example, you describe in great detail and delicacy a gay relationship, right? In what is a very religious Hindu book, right? You don't see any contradiction. The other, very progressive element is on caste. Suheldev himself, you identify as a subaltern leader. You don't say, is he Pasi, is he Rajput, but you identify as a subaltern leader. And you chronicle how he is insulted by, many of the other kings. And practically that comes in the way of, creating Indian unity against the invader, right? And many other aspects. So I was very curious reading the book that you straddle this, ancient world and revisionist historical views with pretty progressive cultural mores. How do you manage that?
My honest view, and I mean this genuinely, I've said it repeatedly, the biggest misfortune of India and Indian liberals, or rather more specifically Indian liberals rather than India, is that many Indian liberals don't realize that our ancient culture is actually their biggest ally. Unfortunately, many Indian liberals are not as well read on ancient Indian texts and philosophies. They are more well read on European or Western texts. So I know it might sound like I'm doing something controversial by showing a gay relationship. I assure you, no, I'm not. Right? Because LGBTs actually had respect and equal rights in ancient times. We never had an approach that LGBTs have to be killed or punished. At least India and dharmic religions never had that approach, right? And I'm not just talking about the philosophical texts, which are obviously of a much higher, more liberal order, but even the Smritis, which are law books. You know, in the Indian way, laws are not the word of God. It's made by human beings, right? So they can be changed, but even the law books, and there are some smritis which are very conservative. There are some smritis which are very liberal, but even the conservative smritis don't necessarily see those which may frown upon LGBT relations. They don't say that a gay couple has to be killed. No, there's nothing like that. The founder of the Chandravanshi clan, Lord Krishna, was a Chandravanshi, right? The lunar dynasty rulers. The founder was a transgender, Ila. She founded it as a woman. She became a man later, but she founded it as a woman. We were deeply liberal in those days, and I think for me it was, you know, one of the things that that I was told as a feedback is that even the relationship was not. Sometimes in Bollywood they make it a parody, right? Gay relationships, which makes it like it's something wrong and bizarre, which, you know, but we have to kind of tolerate. In this book, it's been written as a completely they are two warriors who just happen to be in love with each other. That's it. There's no parody in it. You know, it's not that one of them has to go like this or something like that. No, right? That's one aspect. Even on caste, if you see our ancient texts, King Harish Chandra, who was of the line of Lord Ram, so Suryavanshi, was a Kshatriya ruler, and then actually through a series of circumstances, he actually became a Chandal. He was working at a cremation ground. In Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna says very clearly, Chaturvanyam Maya Shrushtam Guna Karma Vibhagasha, that he created the 4 varnas based on guna and karma. Guna is attributes, karma is deeds. Birth is not mentioned anywhere. So I'd love to say I'm doing something new in this. No, I'm not. Actually, I'm repeating ancient liberal philosophies which we have just forgotten. In the Indian way, you can be traditional and liberal at the same time. It's not a contradiction. It can be a contradiction perhaps in the West, perhaps in many other parts of the world. But in the ancient Indian way, it's not a contradiction. You can be traditional and liberal at the same time.
Well, I want to push you a little bit on the fact that that you're actually not doing something new, right? And here's let me show you something that you're doing which is new, and push you a little bit on that.
Sure.
Which is that the sort of the love, there's a gay love relationship, and then the other kind of love spine of the book is between Suheldev and Toshani, right? Now, sort of in the middle of the book, they both clearly love each other, and Suheldev asks Toshani to marry him, right? And she refuses. And I'm just quoting you as why she refuses. There is a reason that most of the greatest leaders in Indian history have been single, almost like sannyasi, because then their followers believe that this leader is committed only to the people, right? This sounds pretty much like Narendra Modi, right? Like how, and someone as smart as you, Amish, right, definitely knew what you were doing when you put that sentence there.
No, Vinay, this you're giving more credit than is due. Listen, this is actually the Lord Ram approach and the Lord Krishna approach. Once again, Lord Krishna, remember, is Lord Ram is seen as a Maryada Purushottam. Lord Krishna is seen as Purushottam in terms of that he enjoys all the rasas of life as well. And there are two different approaches. Lord Ram, his father had 3 wives, right? If there was a break, tradition dictated he could have got another wife. Why didn't he? Right? And the thing in the Ramayana is that what Lord Ram is most famous for, which is Ram Rajya itself, is discussed very little. Much of it is actually the making of Lord Ram. The very word Ramayana itself means the travels of Ram. Right? Much of the philosophies of Ram Rajya you read in other texts. So I don't know if you've heard of this text called Yog Vashisht, which speaks of the philosophies, and Lord Ram is also described out there. And this concept of Raj Rishi, right? A king or queen, a leader who's saintly, right? Has been in India for millennia, right? It's not just Prime Minister Narendra Modi. You find so many other leaders, male or female. If they're single, there is a different aura they carry in a country like India. Whereas in the West, and I'm living in the UK now, or in the US, they want to see a president who has a wife, who has children, who has a dog even, right? Because they want to see that full, it's a term I've heard out here that they'll vote for someone who they can have beer with. It's a very strange concept to decide how to vote, but it's one of the things I see in the West. But in India, you see, it's not just Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Go through our list of leaders, the ones who've been exceptionally powerful, male or female. Have you noticed they're usually single? And I believe this comes from our obsession with Ram Rajya and us seeing how Lord Ram is, right? Because one of the debates that has always been there in India is the Dhritarashtra syndrome, Putra Moh, and Ram Rajya, right? The Dhritarashtra syndrome is you're willing to sacrifice your nation for your child, right? Whereas the Ram Rajya's archetype is you're willing to sacrifice your family for your nation, right? It may be unfair to the family on this side, but it's very good for the nation. Right? On the other side, in the Indian way, there's no judgment. On the other side, very good father, very good mother, not so good for the nation, right? There's no judgment in the Indian way. So this is not about Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This is actually about what Indian culture is, and smart politicians often, I think, get this. And I'm saying once again, make a list. Even in the last 70 years, think of the most powerful leaders, prime ministers or chief ministers, either widows, widowers, or singles, right? And I think that deep connect is, we see a bit of the Lord Ram archetype. I'm not saying that they are like Lord Ram, but the Lord Ram archetype.
Thanks, Amish. I want to now move out of politics. I think the viewer has now had a dose of politics, and a little more about you and your writing style. Growing up, Amish, I've always been fascinated that you straddle these two different worlds. At one end, there's the world of Banaras, of Sanskrit, which is your family background. The other level, I think you went to a South Bombay School Cathedral, you went to Xavier's, you went to IIM Calcutta, you worked in finance. So in some sense, the old India and the new India, right? And in many ways, your book has been so popular because you are able to kind of traverse both those worlds easily, right? But has that at times given you conflict? I know you've said here that the liberal and the traditional in India are not are sort of idea-wise they're not in clash. But personally, has that created conflict within you?
But the very nature of life is that there'll be conflict, right? The only area or time where there is no conflict is where there's death. If you're dead, then there's no conflict within you. So the point is not about conflict. The point is actually how you resolve those conflicts, right? And many things come instinctively. Like I just noticed that when I'm speaking in Hindi, I'll just say Ganga Ji. It just comes instinctively, right? But when I'm
what language do you think in?
I think it's a khichdi. It may be more Hindi and English, but it's a khichdi, right? Of both languages. And I find that this is the first time I'm living abroad. First time I'm living outside of India. But I'm able to get along with Westerners out here as well who have a completely different mindset. And in that sense, it truly is a privilege, that you can see so much more of the world. That makes a richer life. And there is an ancient Indian philosophy that let all the knowledge of and influences of the world, come to me from all four corners of the world. But Mahatma Gandhi had added one line to that. But we refuse to be shaken from our own roots. So I think Indian roots are flexible and Catholic enough in terms of not the religion, but the word Catholic enough to see the beauty of positive cultural influences from all over the world. Right? Look, Goddess Saraswati could bless anyone. She doesn't have to bless only Indians, right? And if we are engaging with an open mind with everyone we meet, then we are the beneficiaries of it. We learn from it, and no doubt that my schooling, my education, the work that I did helps me do that in some ways. Yes.
Amish, tell us, because I consider myself kind of a best-selling author. But when I look at my numbers and I look at your numbers, then immediately I come to the ground. Again, you're a smart guy. You must ask yourself, why do people sort of like your books, right? Yes, you traverse the old and the new, but in your introduction, you say that Lord Shiva has given you the gift of storytelling, right? But what is that? Like what, growing up, were you the person who told all the anecdotes in the family? Like tell us what this gift is for someone else, including humble me, wants to sell the kind of books you sell. Like, is it inborn? Is it a trait that you nurtured? Is it something you learned from friends? This ability that, every time you write a page, the reader wants to go to the next page.
Firstly, you're being too kind. I'm a big fan of your writing. I love Jugalbandi. So those who haven't read it, among the viewers here, shame on you guys. Go check it out. It is a fantastic book, nice book. It traverses the growth of the BJP and the nationalism through the relationship between Prime Ministers Vajpayee and Deputy Prime Minister Advani. Coming back, I think storytelling, I have to be honest, I never showed any traits of being creative when I was young. I was always a voracious reader. I read a lot. I still read. I read at least 5-6 books per month on average. I read scientific papers. I read, my mother had told me that and she said it wasn't a joke. It had actually happened that we'd gone to buy moongfali and they'd given it on wrapped in that paper. And I was eating and I started reading what was written on the paper. She was like, "You are obsessed by reading from a very young age." So I was always a voracious reader. But I never thought I would be creative. The only kind of creative thing I did was I used to sing for my band at IIM Calcutta. I was the lead singer of the band, but that is it. I never wrote any music.
No, and in social gatherings, were you the one called on to tell stories? Because you have that gift clearly in your books.
No, in fact, actually, I was, I have a twin brother, Rashi. She was always the more outgoing, fun person. It's not that I was completely shy. I would go out. I don't think I was the life of a party or anything. And even in my my marriage, with my ex-wife Preeti, she was the more outgoing, talkative one. Which is why what I wrote in my book at the beginning of Suheldev, and what I've said often in interviews, I genuinely believe it. It is a blessing. I don't understand where it comes from. And the first piece of fiction I ever wrote in my life was Immortals of Meluha, which was a 400-page book. I wrote no short stories, nothing before that. So most school, college friends, who know me from before, many of them have actually asked, "Sach pata actually kisne likha hai?" Because I genuinely showed no traits of even my education. I was a completely left-wing guy. I had BSc Mathematics, MBA from IIM Calcutta, as left brain, not left-wing, left brain as they come. I genuinely believe this is a blessing. Having said that, I also believe that receiving the blessing of storytelling is perhaps the biggest privilege that you can have. Right? Because what happens if you're a storyteller? Others give you something that is the most valuable, which is not money actually. Money is not the most valuable. It is their time, their attention. Right? They give that only to a storyteller. Right? And if you're a storyteller, then through the medium of your stories, you can get your philosophies and thoughts across. What a fantastic privilege is that. And therefore, I always believe that if you have been blessed with a good storytelling skill, it's there for a reason. And which means then the philosophies that you convey should be philosophies that aid the cause of greater good, for the want of a better term, today. If you have the power of storytelling, don't use that to preach hatred. Right? Don't preach dogmatism, for the want of a better word. If someone is, I'm never a believer in turning the other cheek. The first blow should never be mine. But if someone hits me, I will hit back. Right? I'm not going to turn the other cheek because the guy will hit me again. Right? That's the way the world works. So the first blow should never be ours, but we must hit back. So those philosophies should come across. But as far as possible, if you can aid the cause of unity, you can aid the cause of liberalism, if you can aid the cause of dharma, you should use that if you've been given the privilege of good storytelling skills. It's a blessing. I genuinely believe it's a blessing.
Well, thanks, Amish. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask you the last question that readers of yours always want to know, which is what next. Now, at the end of this book, you tantalizingly, you have this description of the Chola king as the most powerful man in the world, and you allude to the fact that the Cholas had schemed to murder Muhammad of Ghazni to take revenge on the sacking of Somnath. And you mentioned that an author will write about it. The author is obviously you. Is that your next book? What else are you planning to write? Because your readers will be waiting.
So yes, that is certainly on my mind. The next book, however, is going to be the fourth book of the Ramchandra series, War of Lanka, which is a bit delayed. My apologies to all my viewers and readers. I have apologized multiple times on this. Various personal issues have delayed me. But it will be out by early next year, it's called the War of Lanka. That's a fourth book of the Ramchandra series. That will be till the death of Ravan, from the kidnapping of Bodhisida till the death of Ravan. But I do intend, besides my core book series, Shiva Trilogy, Ramchandra series, I do intend to write books called the Indic Chronicles on ignored heroes who we need to learn about. Who have been ignored in the last 1,000 years, perhaps some even longer, because of a very Delhi-centric view of our history. Like Rajen Chola, he's reduced to just a few lines in our national history books, which, if you ask me, is a scandal. He's one of our greatest emperors ever. So I do have two books in mind for Rajen Chola, for Emperor Rajen Chola. And yes, that is also a part of the Indic Chronicles. It's a part of the plan.
Thank you very much, Amish. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.